It is said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. But what do the pictures, monuments, and great art of our nation's capital tell us about American history and our founding fathers? Do these monuments, as many modern politicians would have us believe, tell a secular story, or do they hold spiritual significance? What happens to a society who forgets the truths and symbols of its own past? And what are the consequences when we do? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series.
The Capitol Building of the United States of America. What a majestic edifice. This is one of a very few structures which is recognized the world over. When one sees a picture of this building in virtually any land, they know it's the American seat of government. This grand structure has been the scene of some of the most profound moments in America's history. In its 2 centuries of use, this building, these walls, these grounds, they've welcomed the voices of some of our greatest heroes. This building has survived some of America's most desperate and foreboding dangers, and some of the most important issues of American life and culture have been decided within these walls. Truly, this building has many diverse stories to tell. There are stories reflecting its architectural heritage, its political heritage, and its artistic heritage. But especially interesting are the stories reflecting its rich spiritual heritage.
Many visitors of our nation's capital would be shocked to discover that the faith of our founding fathers has indeed been chiseled in stone throughout our nation's capital. But why has this irrefutable evidence of our great spiritual heritage been covered up and forgotten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Nearly every night on the nightly news, people get to see a picture of historically what was the largest church in America, but they don't recognize it as a church, and that's because they see the dome of the U.S. Capitol, and nobody thinks of that as a church. But for nearly 100 years, the U.S. Capitol was the largest church building in Washington, D.C., and it was one of the largest church buildings in the United States. Wow. And we don't think of the Capitol in that sense.
Who was attending that church? Was it common people or senators or elected officials? Who was going?
Well, when you ask about who's attending the church, first think about how many you could fit in the room.
Okay.
Now, if you watch the president when they show annually the State of the Union address, you see crammed in that room 435 members of Congress, 100 senators. You see all the executive branch in terms of the secretaries of the different cabinet level departments. You see all the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. You see all the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You see all these people crammed in, and they got the galleries full. You can fit 1,000 people in there. It's pretty tight, but you can fit 1,000 people in. The House of Representatives is really built to handle 435 people that it has. It's pretty full with that, but they cram 1,000 in. When they were having church services in there, they crammed 2,000 people into that building. 2,000 people a week went to church there. Now, that's obviously more than you have representatives or senators, so what you have was the community came there as a church. It was one of the first mega churches in America. Absolutely. We talk about mega churches today.
Yeah.
Now, you know, even today, 2,000 is a mega church, but you got a small population back then.
Yeah.
That's a huge mega church. It's interesting to see one of the first official acts of the House which occurred when our founders moved into the Capitol, an act recorded in the annals of Congress. The Constitution mandates in Article 1, Section 5, Paragraph 3, that written records be kept of what goes on in Congress. The founders required this because they wanted government open, accessible, and accountable to the people. Within the congressional records, you or I at any time can read what our elected officials are doing and saying, or not doing and not saying, and then hold them accountable. every debate, and every vote which has taken place in Congress from 1774 to the present is recorded in these public records. And it is because of these records that we know exactly what happened when Congress moved into this building. According to the records for late November of 1800, Congress spent the first few weeks organizing the rooms, the committees, their locations, etc. And then, in the first week of December 1800, Congress made an interesting decision. What was that decision? Congress decided that the Capitol building would also serve as a church building. The U.S. Capitol, this building, became a church. The use of this building as a church building is confirmed not only by the records of Congress, but also by the diaries of those who served in Congress at the time. For example, when John Quincy Adams was a U.S. Senator in 1803, he recorded in his diary for October the 30th, attended public service at the Capitol, where Mr. Rattoon, an Episcopalian clergyman from Baltimore, preached a sermon. The week before, he had written, "Religious service is usually performed on Sundays at the Treasury office and at the Capitol. I went both forenoon and afternoon to the Treasury."
You're talking about the U.S. Capitol building in Washington,
D.C.
was a church.
Was a church. They started that in the records of Congress on December the 4th, 1800. By the way, the records of Congress are one of the really cool things the Founding Fathers gave us as part of accountability of government to us.
Right.
Article 1, Section 5, Paragraph 3 of the Constitution, the Founders said, look, everything that goes on in that building, everything said on the floor of the House and Senate, we want it written down where the people can get at it. People can go online to the records of Congress, see what their senator or rep said last week, last month, or 50 years ago, or 200 years ago on virtually any issue. It's all online. So if you want to go online, go to December the 4th of 1800, and you'll see that that's when they voted that the Capitol building would become a church building. So, but wait a minute, why 1800? Why not back in 1789 when the government started?
Right.
Well, a lot of Americans don't realize that the first 11 years of government were in New York City and then in Philadelphia. 1800 is when they first moved into Washington, D.C. So we had the federal government first meet in New York City because they were building the Capitol, finding the land, etc. Then they moved to Philadelphia, and that's where we met next. And then we moved into Washington, D.C. So as soon as we occupy the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., they vote and say, it's going to be a church building. And so what happened was on Sundays, you had alternating between the chaplain of the Senate and the chaplain of the House. They would supervise the service there, and they used the hall of the House of Representatives. It's where the House meets because it's a bigger chamber than where the Senate meets. So that's where they held the church services. So they would alternate on Sundays between the House and the Senate chaplain being in charge. But if a visiting preacher was in town or some distinguished minister from somewhere in the nation, they brought him in to preach on Sunday. So sometimes the chaplains would preach, sometimes it'd be someone else. But you start off with 1800, Thomas Jefferson is the vice president, and he's going to church there at the U.S. Capitol. He becomes president in 1801. He's still going to church at the U.S. Capitol. He went to church there for 8 years. The records of the congressmen who were in Congress then record that not only did Jefferson come to church at the Capitol, he came despite the weather. If it was pouring down rain, if it was blizzard outside, he came, and he always came on horseback. I mean, he just came, very common man kind of stuff, would come on horseback, ride through the rain, ride through the snow, ride whatever, he'd be there. Well, they got to where they left Jefferson a place to sit, and it kind of became the place where the presidents could sit, just up front on the front row, because with 2,000 people cramming in, I mean, if you didn't get there really early, you don't get a seat. So they got, just out of courtesy, they'd leave the president a place to sit, so when he came in, he'd have a place. Well, because they invited visiting folks in, there's a lot of firsts that happened at the Capitol. For example, the first time that a woman preached at the U.S. Capitol was in 1806.
Well.
Thomas Jefferson was at service there. Now, Jefferson's a pretty stiff Episcopalian. I mean, he's Anglican, he's Episcopalian. And this lady they brought in to preach, Dorothy Ripley, was involved in the revivals along the frontier. Now, the frontier back then was Kentucky. Kentucky, Tennessee, that was way out west, that's way out there. So she's having these revival services among all these trappers and hunters and pretty rugged folks. And in the Second Great Awakening style, it was kind of the brush arbor meetings, kind of emotional, kind of fervent, kind of. Jefferson's nice little stiff Episcopalian here. So she cuts loose in the Capitol with her, fiery preaching style, and no problem for Jefferson, doesn't bother him, but he just continues to sit there very, very formal, you know, very, very presidential. And she figures, I'm not getting through to him because he's not moving, he's not responding. So she cranks up another notch and he just kind of sits there, you know, and it's not bothering him, but she's looking for an emotional response. So it's really even humorous to see what happened. But she was the first woman to preach the Capitol.
Many visitors of our nation's capital would be shocked to discover that the faith of our founding fathers has indeed been chiseled in stone throughout our nation's capital. But why has this irrefutable evidence of our great spiritual heritage been covered up and forgotten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
This room, the old Senate chamber, is where Daniel Webster spent nearly 2 decades of public service. One of the original artifacts of Daniel Webster, still here at the Capitol, is Webster's old Senate desk. That desk is no longer in this room, but it is still in use today in the current Senate chamber. By agreement, the senior senator from New Hampshire, the state of Daniel Webster's birth, is still allowed to use Daniel Webster's original desk. However, at the time Daniel Webster served in the Senate, his desk was found in this room. Interestingly, in the bottom of his desk, Webster took a penknife and inscribed his name, and those who used his desk after him followed this precedent. Daniel Webster developed his love for penknives at an early age. In fact, Master James Tappan, one of Daniel's first school teachers, told the story of how Daniel received his first penknife.
Daniel was always the brightest boy in the school. He'd learn more in 5 minutes than another boy in 5 hours. One Saturday, I remember, I held up a handsome new jackknife to the scholars, and I said the boy who would commit to memory the greatest number of verses in the Bible by Monday morning should have it. Well, many of the boys did well, but when it came Daniel's turn to recite, I found that he had committed so much to memory that after hearing him repeat some 60 or 70 verses, I was obliged to give up. He telling me still that there were several chapters yet that he had learned. And Daniel got that jackknife.
Daniel Webster learned early to love the Bible, and his love for that book never waned. In fact, on the 4th of July, 1851, the year before his death, he stood here outside the Capitol and delivered a speech on the occasion of the laying of the cornerstone for the Capitol for the additions that have now become the House and the Senate chambers.
Man is not only an intellectual, but he's also a religious being, and his religious feelings and habits require cultivation. Let the religious element in man's nature be neglected. Let him be influenced by no higher motives than low self-interest and subjected to no stronger restraint than the limits of civil authority. And he becomes the creature of selfish passion or blind fanaticism. The spectacle of a nation, France, powerful and enlightened, but without Christian faith, has been presented as a warning beacon for the nations. On the other hand, the cultivation of the religious sentiment represses licentiousness, incites to general benevolence, and the practical acknowledgement of the brotherhood of man, inspires respect for law and order, and gives strength to the whole social fabric.
Daniel Webster did not believe that the public good would ever be served apart from Christianity. As he reminded one gathering,
Whatever makes men good Christians makes them good citizens.
Daniel Webster, one of the great leaders here in the Capitol, was outspoken about Christianity both in private and in public. The first Catholic that preached at the Capitol was Bishop John England. As a matter of fact, this is the sermon that he preached at the U.S. Capitol. It's delivered in the hall of the House of Representatives by the Honorable Reverend John England. So this is the first Catholic. Now,
What year was that?
this is in 1826. The president that year was John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams enters public service when he's 11 years old.
Wow.
At the age of 11, John Quincy Adams received a congressional diplomatic appointment overseas to Europe at the age of 11. So he enters into public service at 11, and for the next 68 years he's in public service. He's an ambassador to 5 different nations. He's a Secretary of State. He was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court and confirmed, but declined the appointment. He is a U.S. President. He's a U.S. Senator. He spent 17 years in the House of Representatives, and the man kept a diary. And he kept an incredible diary. He started it when he was 11 years old. He kept it for the next 68 years. And so despite all these activities, on his diary entry, he doesn't say, well, I woke up this morning at 7:30 and went to bed at 8:30. He'll have 8 to 10 to 12 pages a day in his diary of what went on. And when it comes to Sundays, he records in his diary who preached, the verses they used, what he thought of the sermon, what he thought they should have used as verses in the sermon. He spoke 7 languages. He read the Bible in 7 different languages. And if you want to be embarrassed, you read in the diary John Quincy Adams, and he'll be reading, you'll be reading on Sunday, and he'll say, well, as I was looking today at Romans 8, it appears to me that the Russians did a much better translation out of the Greek than the French did. Although its German translation is not bad, he's going through all these editions looking back at the Greek to see who. So here's the President of the United States. Well, he records about having met Bishop John England and the sermon he preached that day and how good it was and how powerful it was. And he records about the various times that he heard various people speak. Gallaudet, the guy who founded the School for the Deaf, was one of the folks who preached at the U.S. Capitol. And so over these 68 years of records of John Quincy Adams, you get a steady diet of who is preaching. Chaplains preached. Matter of fact, here was one of the sermons preached by the chaplain, Chaplain Stockton, who was chaplain twice, actually. He served 2 different times in Congress as chaplain. It's called The Imperishable and Saving Works of Christ, delivered in the hall of the House of Representatives. Gives this verse. And I mean, these are very evangelical sermons, very pointed sermons, and this is what we did in U.S. Congress for a century. The National Statuary Hall contains other statues commemorating the lives and accomplishments of many famous Christians, such as this one of Junipero Serra, the missionary with cross held high, and Marcus Whitman, preacher and frontier trailblazer, with Bible held under his arm, and there are many others. On this side of Statuary Hall, we have a statue of Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster was part of the 2nd generation of American statesmen. He was a young man during the American Revolution, and he grew up listening to the speeches of Presidents George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Following his own entry into politics, Daniel Webster became a leading national figure. He served almost a decade in the U.S. House, nearly 2 decades in the U.S. Senate, and he was the Secretary of State for 3 different presidents. Daniel Webster gained a reputation as an exceptional orator. His powers of argumentation were persuasive, whether arguing a case in the Supreme Court or debating a bill in Congress. In fact, so great were his skills that it is reported that attorneys, when learning they'd be opposing Daniel Webster, would sometimes withdraw from a case rather than face Webster's genius. Daniel Webster's strong commitment to the principles of law and the Constitution earned him the title, the Defender of the Constitution. As a famous orator, Daniel Webster expressed the belief that no one could become a great orator without studying the Word of God. In fact, Webster regularly practiced his own oratory by reading the Bible aloud. There are wonderful anecdotal accounts of visitors and Capitol staff gathering just to listen to Daniel Webster read the Bible. Webster's voice would thunder and boom, and it seemed as if the doors would rattle off their hinges as he recited the words spoken by the Almighty. Charles Landman, Webster's personal Senate secretary, recalled,
We well remember his quotation of some of the verses in the 38th chapter of Job. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. And so forth. Mr. Webster was a fine reader, and his recitation of particular passages which he admired was never surpassed, and was capable of giving the most exquisite delight to those who could appreciate them.
Many visitors of our nation's capital would be shocked to discover that the faith of our founding fathers has indeed been chiseled in stone throughout our nation's capital. But why has this irrefutable evidence of our great spiritual heritage been covered up and forgotten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Another one of the statues here in Statuary Hall is this one of Lew Wallace of Indiana. His father was the governor of that state, and Lew Wallace himself held several offices in Indiana. He also served as a distinguished military officer during the Civil War and was the youngest man ever to attain the rank of Major General. He later became governor of New Mexico and then served as a U.S. diplomat. He is perhaps best known, however, not for his military or political accomplishments, but rather for his literary works. General Lew Wallace is the author of the forever immortalized work Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, the classic novel about the life of Judah Ben-Hur. That work, first printed in 1880, not only swept the nation, but it swept the world, being translated into numerous languages. Interestingly, the impetus for this work began in 1876 when General Wallace conversed at length with Robert Ingersoll, a co-officer from the Civil War. Ingersoll, titled by the press as the Great Agnostic, was the national evangelist for atheism. In his conversation with General Wallace, Ingersoll first forcefully asserted that there was no God, no devil, and no afterlife, and then challenged Wallace to try to prove that Jesus was the Son of God. Wallace was disturbed by the conversation and found himself ashamed of his own ignorance about the topics raised by Ingersoll, and especially of his own lack of knowledge about the life of Jesus. Wallace therefore set out to research the life of Christ, as well as the Jewish and Roman cultures of that day. He studied numerous works, including those by Josephus and Edward Gibbon, and he eventually made a trip to the Holy Land to trace the steps of Christ. As a result of his research, two things happened to General Lew Wallace. One, he became a Christian, and two, he wrote the book that even today remains an international classic. Interestingly, not only did Ben-Hur become the best-selling novel of the 19th century, but it probably did more than any other single work to undermine Robert Ingersoll's national message on atheism. Ben-Hur inspired Christians as few works before had done. Its effect was felt across the nation and all the way to the White House. In fact, President Ulysses S. Grant, who had not read a novel in 10 years, made an exception with Ben-Hur and read it through within a day and a half. Grant's statue is here in the rotunda, as is the statue of President James A. Garfield, and President Garfield thought the book was so important that he penned a nationally published letter recommending Ben-Hur. President Garfield even asked General Wallace to write more such novels to benefit and strengthen the nation. General Lew Wallace, commemorated by a statue here in Statuary Hall, was one of the most influential Christian authors of the 19th century.
Can I just tell you how impacting you holding original documents of sermons preached inside of our U.S. Capitol building is when you think of what a generation of people, our generation, were taught in schools as to what separation of church and state, that entire meaning, and what we really are as a people is absolutely proved. We're not making this up.
Right,
You're reading
right.
transcripts and original documents are being used on this show. For example, of these sermons
That's
that were
right.
preached in front of U.S. presidents, that's who we are
That's
as
who
a
we
people.
are. And what's cool is, I mean, we've got just stacks of sermons preached and the different guys who preached them, but we also have the corroborating records of folks like John Quincy Adams who attended there. And you find out the presidents who attended there because the people would write about, oh, President so-and-so was in today and he sat here and he brought this person with him. And as Jefferson would come to church on horseback, that wasn't James Madison style. James Madison went to church at the U.S. Capitol. James Madison would arrive for church in a coach and four big old white horses drawing his coach. So when President Madison got to church, everybody knew he was there.
Things haven't changed much.
That's right. Yeah. But it's that same kind of thing. There's personalities and differences in styles. And Abraham Lincoln went to church there, and that was where he went. And James Buchanan, all these different presidents went to church. All these senators.
When did it stop, Dave?
It stopped sometime in the late 19th century. There was no official act of Congress that caused it to stop. There was no controversy, no dissension, nothing in the records. It just kind of faded out. This man is Alexander Hamilton. You'll find a statue of him in the rotunda. Not only is Alexander Hamilton a signer of the Constitution, but by being an author of the Federalist Papers, he's considered one of the three men most responsible for us having the Constitution today. You may recall that Alexander Hamilton died a premature death at the hands of Aaron Burr in a duel in 1804. Although trained in the art of war and weaponry, Hamilton was one of those who disapproved of personal duels. He tried to dissuade Burr from the duel and even offered other recourses, all of which Burr refused. Hamilton at last conceded to his friends that if he did not face Burr in a duel, he knew he publicly would be branded as a coward and his own personal reputation would be so tarnished that he could never again hold public office. One other consequence of Hamilton's untimely death was that it permanently halted the formation of a religious society Hamilton had proposed. What was that society? Hamilton suggested that it be named the Christian Constitutional Society and listed two goals for its formation. First, the support of the Christian religion, and second, the support of the Constitution of the United States. This organization was to have numerous clubs throughout each state which would meet regularly and work to elect to office those who reflected the goals of the Christian Constitutional Society. This proposed society, whose first goal was to support the Christian religion, was the design of Alexander Hamilton, another of the many men of faith who had a significant influence on the founding of American government. Not only did we have church in the Capitol, the Capitol Church, but there were three other churches that also used the Capitol building for their church. So you had First Presbyterian, you had Capitol Hill Presbyterian, you had First Congregational. I mean, various churches used the U.S. Capitol as their church home. If they were building a new building in D.C., they would move in there while they're building the new building. And so you literally had church services going in the hall of the House. You had church services going in the Senate chamber. You had church services going in the Supreme Court chamber. And yes, the Supreme Court did meet in the Capitol. It wasn't until 1935 that they got a separate building and moved out from under the watchful eye of Congress. But you have 4 churches meeting in the Capitol building.
My goodness.
This concept that it's a secular building filled with secular-minded people, absolute nonsense. On any given week in Congress, we have 120 members of Congress active in one of the 4 major Bible studies in Congress. We got great chaplains at the Congress. They preach great sermons and do great ministry at Congress. We have great members of Congress who are still godly Christian statesmen, just as we've had for 200 years. That is not a secular building. Some secular activities go there, but because of what we see on the media, we think the whole thing is secular, and it's not. So when we look at the U.S. Capitol, we're looking at what was a huge church, but it was also a church, if you will, filled with a lot of Christian statesmen who acted out of principle and conviction. That secular building is one of the greatest religious museums in American history.
For more information on the American Heritage Series or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.